Hello and welcome to Brandtuned, Successful Brand, Successful Business, the show for entrepreneurs and brand creators where we discuss personal and business branding to give you ideas and inspiration for your own brand. I'm Shireen Smith, lawyer, entrepreneur, author, and advocate for developing purpose-based brands to change the world. Will Critchlow is the co-founder of Distilled, an SEO consultancy that was set up in 2005. He and his co-founder, Duncan, first met at school and they founded Distilled soon after finishing university. So they are entrepreneurs through and through. I'll leave Will to describe their journey, which culminated with the recent sale of the business. So welcome to this podcast, Will.
Thanks.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So, Will, tell us a bit more about Distilled. What did the business look like when you sold it recently? How big was it?
So in total, it was around 50 people across 3 offices in the UK and the US. So we got started in London, that was still headquarters, and we had about half a team in the UK and then a smaller team in New York and Seattle. And we were primarily doing SEO consulting, search engine optimization, agency and consulting work. We also ran the SearchPilot conference series, and both of those bits of the business were part of what were acquired, which we can come on to. And we also had a business unit that was at the time called the ODN, the Optimization Delivery Network, which is a technology platform, piece of software that we had developed, which, as I say, was a business unit within Distilled. But as part of the transaction, part of the M&A, we span that out into a independent business and rebranded it as SearchPilot, and we continue to own and operate that.
I believe you'd already embarked on a venture while you were at school as well. What made you so entrepreneurial at such a young age before it became fashionable to be entrepreneurs? Was it your parents who inspired you to think entrepreneurially, or what?
I think, probably a few different effects. I mean, the one I can most obviously point to is my earliest memories of my father starting his own business. So that's not quite true. I remember him having a job when I was very small, but when I was 5 or 6, he started his own business working from home. And he'd previously been a sales director at a company in Leeds, and so he used to commute to the office, and in fact the office was attached to a warehouse, and so some of my very earliest memories are playing in that warehouse and riding on ride-on toys on the massive concrete floor. But I remember him being at home a lot more, and when he was working from home, obviously cutting down, getting rid of the commute and all of those side of things. And I got involved with everything from, in the very early days, I guess, things like stuffing envelopes, licking stamps, and then probably as a 10 to 12-year-old getting involved in things like some basic arithmetic, balancing the checkbook and those kinds of things, up to once my voice broke, I was allowed to answer the phone. And so just before I left home, I would occasionally work for him in the business. So I think that's probably a bunch of my entrepreneurial background. I think also broadly, Duncan and I, some of it was I think the timing. You mentioned that back then it wasn't necessarily cool to be an entrepreneur, and I do remember that. I do feel like the last couple of decades have shown that there's a different kind of person who springs to mind. I think when you talk about business or entrepreneur or founder, these days people probably think of tech founders and those kinds of things. Whereas I think back then it was much more, maybe Richard Branson, but probably mainly just boring businessmen, as it would have been back then. But I think because it was the early tech era, it was also just, we were attracted to the technology. And so some of it was, this is what we were interested in. Oh, I wonder if we can do this instead of getting a bar job or a restaurant, waiting tables and those kinds of things. And so I think it was a bit of opportunity meets a bit of inspiration.
Wow. So what did you say your father's business was?
So he had the business he set up when I was very young was he bought and sold electronic components, so pieces of computers,
Ah,
RAM, computer chips, all kinds of electronic components. Mainly, he was a kind of middleman. It's a very pre-internet business. It was all done over the phone or on the fax machine, and he would, broadly speaking, the big suppliers would only sell you these things in very large quantities. And so if you wanted 5 of these very specialist chips, you couldn't buy them from the manufacturer. And so he would buy large numbers from the manufacturer and sell them in smaller batches to everything from hobbyists to universities to small businesses. And I just remember him building that business up. And he actually still runs it, although he's kind of semi-retired these days and also drives a taxi.
so basically it did involve tech in some way. Were you quite into tech when you were younger, before you went to university?
Yes, I mean, so Duncan was probably more. Duncan went to university to study computer science, and so he was the more tech in that kind of tech startup world language side of things, I guess. But in the broader sense, yes, definitely. I mentioned that my dad's business involved fax and telephone calls and those kind of things. I do remember he had one of the first fax machines that any of our family and friends had ever seen. And even
Uh-huh.
before that, the business that he used to work in had a telex machine, which again is one of my earliest memories, was this thing the size of a fridge that you could, was like a typewriter on a fridge, basically, that you could type at one end and the paper came out the other, and somebody else on the other end of a phone line. And then I remember getting the first, what was probably a 286 PC with an orange, black and white, black and orange screen. And I do remember getting access to a spreadsheet for the first time. It was Lotus 123, and I was probably more into maths and science than I was into pure technology. But that was the time when that kind of came together. I was like, oh, this thing can do maths. That's really cool, and that's kind of how cool I was as a kid.
Wow. So you weren't kind of listening to motivational tapes or anything with your dad at all? No, just running the business.
No, my dad would definitely not go into that kind of thing. He's quite
Mhm.
straight talking. I don't
Mhm.
think he'd be interested in those side of things at
Oh,
all.
I see.
No, it was much more just I saw. I think it's different in different environments.
Yeah.
If your parents are teachers, then you probably get interested in teaching. I saw the freedom that came from being your own boss. I saw
Mm.
the opportunities for self-direction and continually learning things and just diving into what you're interested in. And I got interested in the business side, in the money side, and that I mentioned kind of balancing the checkbook and so
Yeah.
forth. I think that money became a thing that I understood in business sense probably before I understood it in a personal sense. So even before I would have had much pocket money or anything like that, I was seeing the volumes of money that went through a business that was hardware based, right? So the profit margin might only be 10 or 15% on some of these things that
Mm.
he was buying and selling, and so there were large sums of money flowing through for obviously a good living, but a kind of normal sized amount of money out the other end.
Yeah.
And so yes, getting some sense of what profit and loss looked like at that stage was probably the other part of it. So alongside the technology side.
Wow. That's really interesting. And what about something like building the brand? Was brand something that you even thought about before you set up your own business?
No, not really. I think that came later. So that was probably more actually really quite late into the journey. I think
Mm-hmm.
back when we first met. So
Yeah.
when we were very first going to the breakfast networking events and so forth,
Yeah.
we had no sense of brand at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it developed in the years after that as we gradually started piecing together. I think probably reputation came first for us, and kind of thinking through it. Yeah, and obviously that's kind of one meaning of brand in a sense, but getting known for
Mm-hmm.
something was the first taste of brand.
Yeah.
And then as we started growing the business and hiring other people and trying to say, okay, what does this actual whole organization stand for, rather than just what are these two individuals or a handful of individuals capable of? that's when we started to get some sense of it,
Yeah.
having meaning in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's almost indispensable, isn't it, as you grow a business to be able to.
Absolutely.
Did you have a purpose, vision, mission, and all that? Yeah.
Well, that's something that the literal version of that is something that we've always struggled with, of trying to tease apart what's the difference between a vision and a mission and and values and so forth. And I think we got ourselves tied in knots over it, and I think many entrepreneurs do. Having said that, there's something that we definitely got right in there, and we saw that in the M&A process, where I think a big part of the reason that Distilled was acquired was because of the brand in the broadest sense, the reputation, the standing, the understanding of what it stood for and what it was trying to achieve, which it is essentially an encapsulation of those things, of the vision and the mission.
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter what they're called as long as you get it right, I guess. So how did you operationalize your brand so that people in the organization would make on-brand decisions when you weren't around?
So I think, so I don't know if you've ever come across any of the books by an author called Patrick Lencioni. He's not just an author, he's a consultant as well. So he wrote a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which is probably my top recommendation. I wish I'd read it earlier in my career, for building high performance teams. But one of his other books, which so he talks about, what's it called? It's called I can't remember the number. All of his books are some habits of a CEO or an exceptional executive. Anyway, one of his books talks about exactly that, how to operationalize those things that some companies can see as being fuzzy or soft or kind of, I guess, tangential to the core business results. And the thing he advises you to kind of obsess over it is baking your core values in particular into all of the operating parts of your business. And so some things we did there, for example. So I think one thing we did pretty well was the values side at Distilled, where we had an approach where we took those values and tried to, for example, hire against them, promote against them. If in those unfortunate situations, if you need to fire against them, those kinds of things. And I think probably hiring is, if I look back on it, the thing where that worked best. Our alumni, our current team is exceptional, and our alumni are spread out across the industry doing great things. And I think that's the thing I probably feel proudest about looking back over it all. And one big change we made there. So we I think, like many people, we used to do interviewing by having the actual interview, and then the candidate would leave and the interviewers would shake their hand, turn around, go straight back into the interview room and debrief and discuss the candidate they just met. We made a change years ago to say, you're not allowed to do that. Before you discuss the candidate you've just met, you must each go back to your desk and write down your thoughts into a structured format that we had, a kind of checklist that essentially asked people to evaluate the candidate explicitly against our core values. And that was everything from, obviously there were some questions about, do we think they'd be good at the job? But there were also questions about things like, do we feel like this is somebody who would take ownership of problems? And it would ask for how much evidence they'd provided of those statements and a kind of confidence rating, kind of an exponential kind of confidence rating. And this had a couple of effects. I mean, firstly, we thought it was a good thing to do, I suppose, morally, because it removes some of the bias endemic in hiring processes. But the big thing it did, to your question of operationalizing values, was it removed that thing of groupthink and everybody deferring to the most experienced interviewer in the room, and instead got people to capture their own thoughts before they had a chance to be dragged away from that by other people. And it then also turned those conversations from how good do we think this person will be into how well are they going to be aligned with our organization and where we want to go and what we want to achieve. And I think that made a really big difference. And I remember being on both sides of discussions of candidates where I'd scored them highly and my other interviewers had scored them lower, or vice versa. And the discussions that came out of that were much more productive than they would have been if we just gone straight into the discussion, because we'd put in black and white our thoughts first off, and so we couldn't really fudge it, and so it made for very honest, open conversations about those things, and I think better hiring decisions. And so I think probably everything ties back to that. Ultimately, if you get the people right, everything else follows from there.
Yeah. What sort of values did you have that you could actually measure against?
We talked about, so we wrote it as a manifesto. So it was a almost prose, and it starts with, we believe communication solves all problems. And so we would evaluate people's communication skills. And that would be one of the key things. Doesn't matter what job they were applying for, we wanted them to be great communicators. And that covered everything from clarity of communication, can they write, can they speak confidently, but through to things, we define that broadly to include things like giving and receiving feedback. That's a form of communication, and one that we value very highly. And so we would ask explicit questions. So tell us a time when you had to give somebody some difficult feedback, or tell us a time when you received some feedback that you didn't want to hear, and how did you react, and what did you do with that information? Those are kind of typical interview questions that we would ask, and very values driven ones. So yeah, communication, ownership. We always talked about smart and gets things done. Some of this language is a little dated now. We actually didn't overhaul it in the decade before we got acquired, and now obviously it's undergoing some revisions as we integrate into the acquiring company and in the spin out. But yeah, it was that kind of style of core values that and it ended with our kind of, I guess, one of our overarching goals that wasn't a pure financial target or whatever else, which was to build the best place for the best people to work. That's how we phrased it. And there are various ways we hit the mark and missed the mark, I'm sure, over the years. But I think one thing we did achieve was that I think within our industry, Distilled was for a long time one of the best places for somebody early in their career to join and get ahead quickly. If they were ambitious and capable and were prepared to take ownership of their development, then we had people join us with no experience at all. And within a year or two, they were well known within the field, presenting at conferences, for example, or writing well-regarded articles. And I think, yeah, that's some of the stuff that meshed together.
Yeah, presumably you had a training process to induct them into your values and make sure that they knew how you would operate in particular situations. Was your manifesto very detailed?
No, the manifesto itself is not at all detailed. It's less than a slide of A4. It's literally just those sentences. We were never very good at documentation and process. I think that's probably one area of weakness. What we did do, I think, was more bake it into operations more than have it written down anywhere. So, for example, I would always try and meet with every new hire soon after they started. The only thing most of the agenda was just to hear about them. I would just ask them about their background and what brought them to be interested in working at Distilled and so forth. But the only thing I ever had on my agenda was to begin that process of talking to them about the values and why we thought they're important and how they correlated to how they would get ahead at Distilled, which I feel like was the step after getting the job is getting the next job, getting the step up, getting the promotion or career development. And so I would run through that with them. And then it was just all those other little ways that we operationalize things. So it would be there in promotion reviews, the language would come up in performance evaluations, all of those kinds of things. And so, I think it was more trying to bake it fundamentally in than it was having a process or a training methodology.
Right.
In fact, we were never great. Weirdly, we were never great at training. I think we were better at learning than we were at training. That was how I used to talk about it. That we hired people who were curious and the kind of people who took ownership and were self driving in those things, and they were surrounded by smart people. And so there was a lot of opportunity for learning, probably more so than there was formal training. We obviously did some, but I wouldn't have said training was our strong point, but I would say that a lot of people learnt more in those years at Distilled than I think they would have at many of our competitors.
So that was really part of the culture, that they had to learn the ropes for themselves, work it out,
Yes, I
maybe.
mean, and we hired people who we thought were capable of that, and we also pushed them in at the deep end a little bit. We would get them exposed to clients very early on, obviously with experienced people around them to make sure the client experience was solid, but trying to get them as much experience as fast as possible, so that the most capable people could go as fast as they were able to, really. And there were even areas where, I mean, you could see it in other parts of the business, right? We ended up developing this, as I said, Search Live conference series, which is all about professional development. And it's not 101 level training, but it is about that, staying at the cutting edge. And not only did our team attend those, obviously because we were running them, but also we encourage people to put together talks to speak, even fairly early in their career. And that's a huge deal, I think, for somebody to, you learn so much by trying to put together a talk that will impress,
Yeah.
and not only impress, but teach people something. And so I think actually a lot of our own individual learning came from that work that we each individually put in to teach others, if that makes sense. And
Sure.
then we also built a training platform called Distilled, which is like an online learning and development system, which we opened up to the public. So it's a subscription service. People can sign up with a credit card. But we also obviously used it heavily internally. And that is more 101 kind of entry level stuff. So we would put all of our junior analysts and interns and people through it. And now thousands of people have gone through that program in and outside our organization. And that's actually undergoing an overhaul right now, which is kind of one of the cool bits of having a bit more resource post M&A.
Yeah, it must be quite useful as a digital asset for your acquirer to have.
Yes, it's always been part of the kind of broader strategy for us. So we figure that those people who get their start learning from our material, further down the line, they come to a conference, they spend £1,000 or whatever of conference budget coming to our events. And then even further down the line, when they become somebody who is hiring, or they become somebody who's looking for a more senior job, or they become somebody who's looking for an agency, that's when they remember Distilled.
We'll take a short break at this point, as I'd like to mention the brand-tuned series of webinars which support founders to think through their brand, taking IP into account at the right time, which is before you make firm decisions about what to create. Just visit brandtuned.com and the webinars are referenced right there on the homepage. Okay, back to the podcast now. So what did you find most challenging and most rewarding about creating this distilled brand that you had?
Interesting question. Interpreted broadly, I think probably the answer to both is the people. I think most business challenges really are people challenges somewhere along the way. And some of the kind of missteps or challenging parts of trying to get the alignment, trying to get people bought into a common vision. I remember a really rough time in probably 2014, 2015 kind of era, when we'd undergone, so the previous few years, we'd undergone really fast expansion. That we'd opened up in the US in 2010, we'd opened up in New York, so Seattle first in 2010, in New York in 2011, we'd launched Distilled in 2012. The conferences have been growing and all these kind of things. We'd grown kind of quite quickly. And I think 2014, 2015 was the first ever flat year, year of no top line growth. And it was, we realized as well that in the growth, we'd ended up with groups of people who had different personal objectives, and not all of those were aligned with where the business was trying to go. And that was a really, really tough time, because it was like being pulled in lots of different plausible, exciting directions by talented people. But the problem was they were different directions, and it really took years to unpick that. And I think, I don't know if I could do it better if I was doing it again, but I certainly would. In SearchPilot, the business we've just spun out, which is currently 14 people, and much earlier in that stage of defining who it is or what it is. I think it's something that we're much more rigorous about. It's much more like, this is how we're doing it, and we want you here if you want to be a part of that, rather than come and make this whatever you think it should be. And I think some of that, we had probably a bit too much of the latter, just for time there at Distilled. So that was probably the hardest part. But I think the most rewarding part is that it's basically the same thing, is seeing the fruits of that pay off in people's careers, and whether that's people who stayed with us, and we've had people who've come, who've joined in, graduate positions, or without degrees, early in their careers, first job, second job, those kinds of things, who've gone all the way up to leadership team, senior management. They've had equity in the business, they've had big paydays in the business, or whether it's the people who came, did an incredible job for us for a few years, developed their presence and reputation and all the rest of it, and then went and got a job that they would have had no shot at before that time. And I mean, they deserve the credit for that. I'm not trying to say we did that. They definitely did that. But the rewarding part was being part of that journey, and being able to help build some part of that platform that gave them the opportunity to do that. And I think that's that group of, I mentioned earlier, the alumni. So the current team plus the set of people who we've ever worked with spans lots of very talented people across the industry, and obviously some have moved out of the industry now. And I think that definitely feels like the thing that you look back on a decade later and feel good about.
Right. So SearchPilot is a product business, is it, that you're holding on to?
Yes, it's a software as a service. So it's software, but it's something that we host and we offer up in return for a monthly recurring license fee. It's technology that we built as part of Distilled. So we formed an R&D team. Actually, the R&D team formed probably around the depths of that hardest part that I talked about, that kind of 2014, 2015 time. And initially with quite a broad remit of just experimenting with ways that technology could make us better and more effective. And then this was just one of the things that they ended up building. And a few years later, it became not just one of many, but became the thing that team was working on. And we changed it from an R&D team into a business unit, gave it revenue targets and the like, and put a general manager in charge of it, a VP who had responsibility for it as a P&L. And so it's technology. What it's for is mainly targeted at larger enterprise type websites. It has two primary benefits. One is that it allows SEO A/B testing, so it enables us to test SEO hypotheses and prove what works and what doesn't in the search engine, in organic search, which is pretty groundbreaking and very difficult to do without our technology. And the other part of the benefit is that it enables some of these large organizations to be more agile, to make changes to their website that they otherwise wouldn't be able to make. And it's successful in both of those angles. And it's grown to be a substantial team. As I said, 14 people working on it. We've got some of the team in the US as well. And what happened as part of the M&A was we essentially said, this isn't really a business unit, this is really two businesses. And that what we did was spun it out. The original shareholders of Distilled, so Duncan and I, who owned the majority, plus there was as I mentioned, a kind of a group of past and present senior team who had earned shares along the way. So they between them owned a minority stake, and that group owned SearchPilot. So the people who helped us get Distilled started as well have a stake in the technology business still. And then as part of the deal to spin out, we also took some investment, so a small minority stake investment from the company that acquired Distilled. So the company that acquired the rest of our business, the consulting and events business, put an investment into SearchPilot to help it get up and running and standing on its own 2 feet. And so they have a small stake, but Duncan and I still own 80% between the two of us.
So are you impacted by this coronavirus in that business as a matter of interest? Have you had to furlough staff?
So we are impacted, thankfully not in the way that some businesses are. I mean, I think obviously that I'm aware of plenty of businesses that are completely shut down if you're running a restaurant or a travel business or those kinds of things. So it's not like that. We're all working from home. We can all be perfectly effective working from home. We do, unfortunately, fortunately, as part of it, we do have exposure to businesses who themselves are very heavily impacted. So some of our customers are in the travel sector, for example, and we've been working with them to give them as many options as we can. So we're letting them pause their subscription or reduce their subscription or giving them longer payment terms and those kinds of things. So obviously all of those have knock-on effects on our business, which is only a very small business without a deep balance sheet itself. So yes, actually we have been taking advantage, only just recently taken advantage of the UK government furlough scheme, and we're applying for some of the stuff that's available in the US as well, where the US government is helping small businesses through this time. So we're impacted, but not devastated by it. You know, the business will definitely survive it, and our goal is to come out the other side with the full team that we went into it with. We won't come out the other side with every client we went into it with. We know that, but we want to keep working with as many of them as possible and set ourselves up for hopefully some growth in the years to come. I mean, you've traded through. We remember 2008, 2009. And I graduated into the .com bust as well. So I think I'm much more worried about the health and lockdown impacts than I feel like we can be okay financially, and this business can grow even in a recession. I'm worried about the impact of the recession on other people, of course, but I believe that a technology business can do well, even in what I imagine will be a recession that follows this spectacular economic shock. But I have no more information than anybody else about how we get through it. But that's kind of where we stand. Is we'll get through it, but we are impacted.
Yeah. So did you think about exit when you set up Distilled? Was it a long-term plan of yours to exit?
We used to talk about selling a business well before we had a business. So Duncan and I remember I mentioned graduating into the .com bust. What that means is just before graduating, it was the .com bubble, and we in 99, 2000, somewhere around there, Duncan and I used to dream up all kinds of internet business ideas and talk about selling them for millions. Weirdly, then when we actually set up our own business, we didn't really think about the exit. And people used to ask us about our exit strategy, because I think that's the kind of thing that people ask entrepreneurs without really knowing what they are asking. I've certainly never found it particularly helpful to think about that. We basically figured maybe we would sell it one day when the time came, but it was not a thing that we were planning for throughout. And I know some people who do, and they've been very successful at doing that. But no, for us it was, we'll do this while we're having fun doing it, and it's growing, and we can see the next opportunity. When it gets to the point that we think opportunities are different, or the right kind of opportunity comes along, or any of those things kind of line up, then we'll think about that. And really, this was a bit of a lightning striking in the same place kind of opportunity. That there were 3 or 4 things that had to come together to make this even possible, because it was a complicated deal, right? To spin out the technology business, capitalize it with a small bit of investment, sell the rest of the business, manage my involvement in both of those things. There were not a plethora of potential acquirers who would do all of those things. This was really, just this one company we fit well with, and this makes perfect sense.
What is a brand that you particularly admire, and why, Will?
So there's lots of big company answers to this, but they're a bit trite and commonly covered ground. The one I would mention, I think, is a company called Wistia, which is run by some good friends of ours. So this is a video hosting company, and they're headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. And we've known them since their very earliest days. I think they probably got started at a similar time to Distilled, maybe slightly after. I don't know their timeline exactly, but I've always described their business as they were always the standard answer to if you could have founded one other business that wasn't your own, which business would you like to run? I think they've the thing I love about their brand in particular is the way they've infused their personalities and their sense of fun through it. They kind of somehow remained professional, yet they're obviously enjoying themselves, and I really, really respect that. And I love everything about the brand. And in fact, I'm wearing one of their t-shirts now. It's so faded that you can't really tell, but it's probably a decade old. But they used to describe themselves as an unprofitable t-shirt manufacturer propped up by a video hosting platform, because they just used to spend a lot of their money on things that they thought would make people happy and that would have people remember them. And I love the way it all ties together. It's really congruent with their whole business. And incidentally, they went through some really interesting decision making. They've written publicly about it, so I can share it. But some interesting decision making processes about what to do with their business. They considered selling, and in the end decided not to, but did a fairly rare kind of financing where I believe the founders took some money off the table, but they took on some basically venture debt, and in ways that it kind of leveraged structure that would maybe be more common in a bigger business. And I believe it worked out pretty well, where they managed to both take some money off the table and then quite quickly grow the company and improve the financial performance to the point that the debt that they'd taken on to do that was not a drag on the business, and they could refinance it at better terms and so forth. And I obviously I just think it's great when people take those kind of risks and make them pay off.
That's really interesting. We'll have a mention of them in the show notes so people can refer
we can dig
to
out
their
a link
website.
to the founder wrote, or the founders wrote a really long piece on their thinking and why they decided not to sell and what they're planning to do. So hopefully people enjoy reading that.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Will, for coming to this podcast.
No, thanks for inviting me on. It's I love just talking through these things, and it's funny looking back over the history, which I mean we met right at the beginning of this journey, so it's
That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the brandtuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtuned.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you, and bye for now.